what I'd like to talk about is a bit of a more technological issue that we face in terms of ensuring the safety of the food supply that we have, both within this country and internationally. And just to put it all in perspective, and what I'd like to do as I'm going through this discussion is basically break it into three components. What's the current situation? What is the problem? I would like to mention a little bit about a couple of thoughts on how the role of academics can play in finding solutions to this. And then finally, I'd like to give a specific question to our panelists. And so a little bit to keep this all in perspective, unless you are out there as a subsistence farmer, most of you go through a process of high degree of trust every day with the fact that you put food into your mouth that you have no idea where it was grown, how it was grown, how it was harvested, how it was processed, distributed, marketed, and in many cases, particularly if you're a student here, probably don't even know how it was prepared. So you're putting your faith in a lot of insights. I expected to hear some giggles in the back there. And so you're putting a huge amount of faith in both the industry and many segments of the industry and in terms of government agencies. So what I'd like to do is just put this a little bit in perspective and give you the situation and ask you, what do you know about the food you eat? And so the first question I always like to pose is, do you know where your food comes from? And interestingly, most people guess wrong for many foods. So for example, the first example I use is juice. And many of you had either apple juice or orange juice this morning with breakfast. So do you even know where your juice comes from? Well, the reality is if you would have guessed in terms of orange juice and said, oh, well, I get orange juice from Florida, yeah, you're probably correct part of the time. If you said I get my apple juice from Washington State, yeah, part of the time. But actually, the biggest supplier of orange juice to the U.S. consumer is actually Brazil. And apple juice comes from either China, which is the #1 supplier of apple juice, or Eastern Europe, or Chile. And so that would be one guess. And you got it partially right. Let's go a little further afield, seafood. Where do you think your seafood comes from? And of course, most people in the United States would say either somewhere down off the Gulf Coast, or possibly up and around Alaska. And in fact, if you looked at the top 5 providers of seafood, yeah, those two areas actually do contribute. But the major producers are actually the west coast of South America, the west coast of Africa, and the largest supplier of seafood is Asia and the Philippines. And so that's where most of our fish comes from. And then finally, the last one is spices. We don't even appear anywhere on this one. This is all basically foods that come from equatorial regions. We get most everything from Asia, a lot of them from Africa, and from South America. And so there if you're eating those, you are involved in the international trade of food. And in fact, it is one of the interesting facts is the United States is one of the top largest exporters of food. It is also among the top largest importers of food. We get food from over 100 different countries, and we are doing that increasingly. We live in a world of a global food market. We move food all around the world to meet the consumer demands on a day-by-day basis. So if I was to ask you as a consumer to go out and look at a commercial fast food hamburger, and I asked you, well, where do you think that came from? And you started looking at the supply chain. So most people can start to pick that apart. This was what to a consumer might be a reasonable supply chain. And you'll see that you've got meat and cheese and the roll, and people will think maybe about the condiments, but they all bring those together. That's not how a professional looks at it. This is what the supply chain looks like if you are a professional food scientist. And these are all the ingredients that would go into that hamburger that you see up there in the top right hand. And so it is a science. It is not a culinary art, though that it certainly is part of it. but these are the ingredients that are typically involved, and these come from all over the world. And this is a picture of what the world food market looks like if you're here in the United States. We start off with the farm, and there's about 2 million of them here in the United States, and there's about 7 million of them foreign farms that contribute to the food. And we go through this whole thing, and it gets down to finally there's about 1 million food markets in the country. And so you have a highly complex supply chain for which you make a mistake anywhere along that supply chain and you can get people sick. So it's a very complex system. And it's also a very diverse system. And this is one that sort of is the epitome to me, these two pictures, of the diversity that we see within the food system. Because on the left-hand side, this is a laser sorter that examines every peanut that goes down a chute and eventually will get into your peanut butter, or it will be in the dry roasted nuts that you have. It inspects them one at a time for color changes to see if they may be contaminated with molds. And this thing goes at such a rapid pace that you can't even see it. It's a blur of peanuts. But it's your primary safeguard for not getting contamination with aflatoxin, a highly carcinogenic compound that's produced by molds in peanuts. On the other side, in the right-hand side, this is what it looks like in the west coast of Africa, which is also a very large peanut-producing area, where they do the same thing. They're looking at the color of the peanuts and then removing those that have an off color, because that's a way to make sure that you get rid of the peanuts that might be mold contaminated. Both of them work approximately the same. Both of them are accepted means of sorting, but this is the epitome of the difference from highly technological to just above subsistence farming. So, how do you manage this kind of a global food chain if you are a major producer or even a small producer? How do you get involved if you have to trust suppliers that are literally coming from all over the world in order to make a safe food? Well, first off, you have to start thinking about systems and the intricacies of it. And you need knowledge and data. And there's a huge amount of knowledge and data that's generated around the world, essentially for every lot of food that's produced. And you have to ask a lot of questions. Where did the raw ingredients come from for that food? What were the conditions under which they were produced? What was the weather? What's the agricultural workers that were actually producing it? What's the level of contamination that you can expect from these raw ingredients? Where were the ingredients stored and handled? How were they distributed? Under what conditions? Because they all can affect the safety of the product. How were the ingredients processed? What were the effectiveness of the prevention programs and intervention programs put into place? As you bring all of these together and then manufacture a food and distribute it. This requires a huge diversity of expertise. It requires people that are knowledgeable in agricultural sciences, engineering, microbiology, chemistry, packaging, economics, behavioral sciences, communication specialists, climatology, public health, policies. They just go communications. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And the problem is that most of these people do not talk to each other. And so it's hard to get these, and actually one of the things that is always very valuable in this situation is the people that sit at the interface and actually translate that into decision-making processes for major corporations, for regulatory agencies, or even for purchasing agents at medium-sized companies. This is further complicated by the fact that the supply chain is highly segmented. Even within agricultural production, it's segmented into who owns the land, who grows the crop, because it's not always the landowner that is actually the producer of the crop. There's a lot of renting of land. The harvesters, particularly in a large-scale operation, are private companies. That's what they do. We have packers that put them into the right shipping containers, move them around to different companies. Once you get into food processing, you're dealing with multiple ingredients, branded products, co-packers, again, highly segmented. Distribution systems, when a food leaves a manufacturing plant and it's put on a truck, it belongs to the transport company. They have the responsibility for it until it's delivered at the next segment. So we have a player that probably has very little expertise in food that now takes the responsibility for shipping it. Marketing, you have multiple levels of wholesale and retail marketing. Preparation, we eat over 50% of the food that we eat here in the United States is prepared outside the home. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not consumed in the home, but a lot of it is actually prepared outside the home and brought into it. Now, as I already indicated, there's a great deal of information generated about all the different aspects of foods by those different segments of the industry. However, there is very little information flow that goes from segment to segment, and very much a limited amount of that information flows to regulatory agencies that have responsibility for oversight. There's a lot of reasons for this. Proprietary concerns. I don't want to have the company next to me know what my secret sauce is, what the ingredients of. There are regulatory concerns about regulatory agencies going to places where the industry may not want them to. We have lack of informatics infrastructure. And one of the things that I've always amazed, because I figured once I left government and I knew what their informatics problems were there, I figured all these companies have at their corporate headquarters the ability to push a button and they know exactly what things are going on throughout their system at the touch of their fingerprints. No, it's not true. They have as much of an informatics infrastructure problem. And so we have a lack of expertise, particularly when you're talking about small to medium-sized companies. So just quickly, how can academia help? Well, part of the problem is the way academia is structured. And I might note that I've been very encouraged coming to the University of Maryland that has gone to a great deal of effort to make sure that there are a lot of centers and institutes that actually try to bridge the stovepipes that are often represented in traditional academic structures. We have a lot of drivers pushing us to this kind of interaction. And then finally, you have to consider what's being rewarded, because are we rewarding people that are interested in transdisciplinary programs? And we're seeing a shift, but it's one that's always hard. Okay, so I'm going to leave this commercial on for our institute, and I'm going to pose the question that I have to our panel, and took the time to write it out so I don't get it wrong, is how do you handle worldwide information that is highly diverse and largely unstructured in a real-time basis to predict problems and make decisions that help ensure the safety of the food supply? Because there is a very large industry out there that is just dying to find the answers. And so I pose that to you.
Well, one of the things Google is pretty good at, and all the search engines being included are really good at, is extracting reasonably unstructured text from the body of stuff that's out there on the web. So one of the tools you probably know about at Google is the flu trends, right? So one of the things we do with flu trends and with the Correlate products is look at what's going on in the world and look for indicators and signifiers of that. So for example, we can tell that an outbreak of flu is happening before the CDC knows about it. So you can imagine an analogous thing for various kinds of food safety issues. You can imagine building a tool like that that would look for spikes in, say, outbreaks of E. coli or related symptoms. So I think there are tools like that that could be built. And I think another issue that comes up is in country of origin labeling, right? So we've got this huge problem where we can pass laws that say we actually need to have all of our food labeled as to where it comes from in order to give people the information so they can make choices about what it is they're going to do with their food. And yet, we have this complex welter of, we live in a complex system. We live in a complex legal and regulatory ecosystem where we may not have the ability to actually do what it is we want. And I think that's probably true for all of this stuff. So we can look at the information, we can extract it, we can analyze it. Whether or not we can regulate it is a different issue.
Another thing is, I'm thinking that through this food chain, more and more likely it's going to be that people will have mobile devices along the way, right? So if there was some kind of system where you could propagate the information through mobile phones, that could also be very useful, I guess.
The U.S. food supply is pretty good compared to anywhere else in the world. And I think what that's led is a compliance or a complacency of individuals to not care. It's good enough that they don't see a problem. And so you say, you know, this thing about reward, well, most of the consumers are already rewarded and they've got a pretty good food supply. You're not seeing lots of outbreaks of E. coli. They happen, but comparatively, we're doing a pretty good job.
In our roles as futurists,
I'm throwing it out there. That was like everyone, like, okay, we have a problem, and I always like to say, well, do we really have a problem? Is it real or perceived?
Does it matter?
Does it matter?
I mean, if the consumer perceives that there is a problem, there is a problem.
Do consumers perceive there's a problem?
Very much so. The other issue is, and I appreciate your comments and actually use your approach in terms of identifying early outbreaks. But remember, the focus here is to prevent outbreaks. And the impact on the economy whenever you have one of these outbreaks, for example, the listeria outbreak that is taking place now in cantaloupe, that will depress the sale and distribution of cantaloupe worldwide for probably a period of 2 years. So the focus here is being able to predict ahead of time. And there's some indications that you can actually do it, but it's the complexity of the situation and how do you gather the data and then evaluate it in an appropriate manner.
So I think like the tools...
Cheaply, because the other issue I wanted to bring up is if right now, if a problem occurred, the source of a problem was in Africa, we wouldn't know because they just don't have the communication systems that the rest of the world has.
So I think that this is going to be a fascinating topic to follow up on at the end of all the presentations. Dan, unless
I have a 30-second
in real quick.
30-second real quick thought. I actually wanted to build on Mary's comment about having mobile devices that can look at things and track them and understand it. Imagine a world where every article, every item of food that you eat actually has a little tiny laser code on it. So when the peanuts are going through the peanut sorter, a little laser puts in a barcode on it and says what time it went through the sorter and where it's from. And then you could actually take your phone, your device, and point it at the item of food and get the whole audit trail of that individual peanut. Think about that as a future, right?
Let's thank Bob again.